Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat. So, since it's practically been
84 years
since we've had any real, confirmed and substantial news regarding The Last of Us Part 2, I figured I'd do a video, or, well, it became more than that I've wanted to make for a very long time. So, in today's first episode of my The Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, we're going to start taking a look at, piecing together, reconstructing and trying to make sense of one of the original storyboards that was at the Naughty Dog office during development of the game. So, without further ado, let's get on! Okay, actually, before we start, I want to talk about some stuff really quick. Originally, the plan I had for this video, or well, series, was to only look behind the scenes of the storyboard and just do one simple summary video as a fanfiction based on it. Like a Star Wars theory video, for those of you who know who that is. However, in the end, I've come to the conclusion that my ability of good storytelling isn't great enough to do just that. At least not at the moment. And besides, I also feel like that would be a bit too big of a departure from what I usually do. So, what I've decided upon instead was to do a mix of both ideas. Starting with going over the general things we can see on the board, like I'd usually do in this first episode, and then try to reconstruct each segment of the timeline chronologically as a fanfiction / attempted storytelling, based on what we can see. And then finally discuss that specific segment. Not the stuff I make up, of course, but just what we can see on the storyboard. This, however, will be done over several different episodes, which of course you already know if you're part of the Discord server, or watched the previous channel update, because there's just way too much to cover in one video. But I have to be real with you for a second. I haven't done anything like this before. While I am excited to try something new and I think it's important to challenge myself and reinvent my channel a bit, I do feel like it's sort of a gamble. So I hope it's not too bad. Anyways, now let's get on with it. So, the 8th of September last year, Naughty Dog posted this to their social media. Quote, "We're truly honored to have The Last of Us featured in the Victoria and Albert Museum #videogames exhibit opening today in London. If you have a chance, be sure to check it out." Unquote. Along with a few pictures of a concept art notebook and, most importantly, a close-up of the OG storyboard for the game. Now, what I find weird is how little traction this gained in the community, which alongside me finding it fascinating is why I've wanted to make this for so long. Moving on, just with a quick glance, we can already see that there is a major difference between the timeline and the real game here. The game starts during winter instead of summer, and has 5 quote-unquote seasons instead of 4. Late winter / early spring, spring, summer, autumn, and then winter again. I think the reason this didn't make it into the final game is a combination of the developers being limited by the boundaries of the PS3, as shown for example by Frico when he goes into the game's files and show us how many of the game's levels were much larger originally, which probably applied to the scope of the story too. However, it's also most likely a creative decision. The winter section in the final game is really the climax of things going to shit, and takes us through the darkest hour of our characters. And that is really reflected in the harsh, low-resource winter. To not only have the game start there, but to go back a second time at the end would ruin the entire symbolism of the winter later when Joel gets impaled. And frankly, I prefer it the way it is in the real game. Like a full circle kind of story. They start out in summer, which is the least dark part of the game, and as the story progresses it becomes more harsh and darker, just like the seasons themselves. Until the end, when spring comes along and they can leave this hell of a mission behind and go for a new start. Just like nature starting a new cycle and being reborn after the dead winter. Moving on, we also have these post-its saying either M or H, all across the entire timeline. But I have no idea what they could mean. Maybe initials for different teams working on those specific parts? It's probably something very obvious I'm missing, so be sure to tell me what you think in the comments down below. But aside from that, I think we have the general stuff out of the way. So let's get into the fun stuff and start going over each part of the timeline more in depth. Beginning with what I assume is the prologue, since it doesn't have a season tag like the other sections. Now, I'm gonna try to tie this together the best I can, and then I'll go over the whole section afterwards, so bear with me. During a quiet fall night, the distant nighttime Austin shines with its skyscrapers like beacons in the dark. But out in the suburbs, the people have started going to bed, and the only lights shining are the street lights. In the street is a single man surrounded by what looks like a cloud of dust, twitching and moaning like a rabid dog. Rachel, a young teenage girl sleeping in a nearby house, doesn't realize what's about to happen. She wakes up from a nap as her father finishes a phone conversation with his brother Tommy.
Let's talk about this in the morning, okay?
Rachel sits up as she sees the dark outside. Afraid she's missed her father's birthday, she anxiously asks what time it is, to which Joel jokingly responds that it's way past her bedtime. Relieved, she reaches for a little box she'd hidden under a pillow and gives him his birthday present. Opening it, her father decided to joke around with her and told her the fairly high-end watch she'd saved up for ages was broken. Rachel rushed up to it in disbelief and was not amused when she realized she'd been fooled.
Oh, haha.
The pair proceeded to watch a game of football on TV together, but it being very late, Rachel quickly falls back asleep again. And since Joel isn't really interested in the game, he gets up and carries her to bed. Hours later, Rachel wakes up from someone calling her on her bedroom phone. Picking it up, she hears her Uncle Tommy demanding to speak to her father. But before she can even ask him what's going on, the call gets cut off.
Hello?
Sarah, honey, I need to get your daddy on the phone.
Uncle Tommy, what time is it?
I need to talk to your dad now. There's something...
Confused and slightly afraid, she gets out of bed and proceeds to look for Joel all around the house. The bathroom, his room, the kitchen, the living room. He was nowhere to be found.
Dad?
When she finally went into his office, he suddenly burst into the house, immediately starting to open all of the drawers in his desk, frantically searching for something. After a little while, he pulls out a box and takes out a revolver and some bullets. When Rachel tries to approach him, he tells her to stay back from any windows and doors.
Don't go near the doors, just stand back there.
Confused and frightened, she stands back, and before she knew it, their neighbor, bloody and rabid, starts throwing himself at the garden glass door. Joel takes the revolver and gets in front of her in a protective position. After a few times of slamming into it, what was once Jimmy, their neighbor, breaks through the door, forcing Joel to shoot him. Rachel lets out a scared whimper and Joel turns around, looking her straight in the eyes, telling her that they have to get out of the city. But before he can explain anything further, Tommy pulls up in the driveway, urging them to get in so they can get away as soon as possible. The brothers, having discussed it earlier that night, they depart for their mother's house where they hope to ride everything out. Driving on the small town road past all their neighbors' houses, everyone seemed to be packing their cars to get out. But where would they go? Shortly after leaving the neighborhood, Tommy decides to take a shortcut on a gravel road through the woods past a farm. A few minutes later, they are met by a horrifying sight. They find the once proud building on fire. Tommy made a comment about hoping whoever lived there got out. But unknown to him, the very owners he was talking about at the same moment, in their desperation, tried getting in front of the car to get a chance of a ride out of there. But because of the darkness, Tommy doesn't see them in time and isn't able to brake.
Look out!
Hitting what must have been the father of the family. Confused, they stop and Tommy gets out of the car to check what's happened. Shocked and outraged over both losing her husband and her home on the same day, the just widowed mother begins screaming and hitting him, blaming him for everything. Joel, still sitting in the car, instinctively wanting to protect his daughter and get to safety as fast as humanly possible, gets out of the car too, and fires his gun in the air to break up the fight. Everyone stops in their tracks and don't say a word. But before any of them can make a move, a crazed man in a hospital gown runs out through the tree line and attacks the mother. Joel, realizing what that meant, having seen similar attacks earlier during the night, quickly rushes back to the car to get Rachel. But when he gets there, he makes a terrible discovery. She can't move. In all the chaos and their abrupt departure from home, she'd forgotten to wear her seatbelt, resulting in her breaking her leg in the crash.
My leg hurts.
Determined to keep going no matter what, Joel picks her up and carries her. Tommy, seeing more coming through the woods, yells for them to get out of there. Having his hands full, Joel gives his brother his gun and tells him to keep them safe as they make their way toward the military checkpoint reportedly set up on their local highway just through the woods. They run for a few minutes and almost escape their pursuers, but slow down by having to carry Rachel. The infected eventually catch up. Seeing no other option, Tommy tells his brother to run ahead as he heroically stays back and tries to hold them off to buy some time. Joel, full of adrenaline and not seeing any other option himself, obliges, and the last he sees of his brother is an infected pushing him to the ground. A few minutes later, Joel and Rachel arrive at the edge of the secure area around the checkpoint, but before they can get to safety, they are stopped by a patrolling soldier, who, despite Joel's insistence and pleas that they aren't sick, is ordered to shoot them.
Sir, there's a little girl. But... Yes, sir.
Realizing this, Joel, adrenaline still pumping through his veins, drops Rachel and rushes toward the soldier to try and save his daughter. Unfortunately, before he can push the soldier to the ground, he manages to fire, hitting Joel in his arm. But despite his injury, he overpowers the man and chokes him to death. Thinking they're finally safe, he gets up to get to Rachel. But as he turns around, he sees her clutching her stomach, sobbing in pain. A stray bullet had managed to hit her. Panicked, Joel runs toward her and tries his very best to stop the bleeding, but ultimately fails, and loses the only family he has left. Now, obviously most of that was just made up by me, but I based it around the key scenes Naughty Dog has laid out on this storyboard and, of course, a lot of inspiration from the original game. I think that the prologue was, with some minor changes, always supposed to be kind of the way it is in the final game, since the purpose of it was basically to set up Joel's harsh, broken man character with his daughter, whether her name is Sarah or Rachel, dying as a device for that, as well as set the dark tone for the rest of the game. It was never meant to give a backstory of the Cordyceps or detail the complete fall of civilization. In the real game it did what it was supposed to, and in this version it does the same. Now let's go over some of the things in more detail. What I find interesting here is how the game supposedly opens in a city street, and a man is infected by spores in it? That just seems like a very weird thing. The Cordyceps doesn't work like that. The spores cannot infect anyone in open spaces like a city street, since the concentration is way too low. They still appear practically everywhere, even in city streets, which we can see in the real game too. But they only infect in airtight enclosed spaces. Secondly, even if he was infected by those spores, how would we know? Symptoms aren't supposed to start showing for at least a few hours, and this post-it seems to imply that it should be obvious that he gets infected, even when we don't know about the whole spores thing. Which would mean that he would instantly become a runner then, otherwise how would we see that he is infected? I think the intention behind this scene was maybe to set the mood and foreshadow the upcoming apocalypse, and the fact that this person was infected so quickly is most likely due to the exact way the Cordyceps works wasn't really decided yet. In the end, I'm glad they didn't go with this opening, as it instantly puts the focus on the apocalypse and sickness, which isn't what The Last of Us is supposed to be about. It would be a misleading first impression and overall weaker opening than what we got, in my opinion. Moving on, we have the intros for Rachel, Joel, and Tommy shortly after each other. it isn't specifically stated that they take place in Joel's and Sarah's/Rachel's house, like in the real game. In fact, it's actually under the post-it saying farmhouse, but I think that's referring to Lewis's farmhouse that they also pass in the actual game. So I figured that this part plays out pretty much the same as that in the real game. Well, the whole prologue does, and I already explained why I think that is. Now, the only thing that really changes besides all of them escaping through the woods instead of a small town is Tommy dying, in quotation marks. In the game we got, we know that he survives because, well, he saves Joel. And not long after that, Marlene talks about him being in the Fireflies.
I was close with his brother Tommy. Said if I was ever in a jam, I could rely on him.
Was that before or after he left your little militia group?
Meaning he survived way past the outbreak too, even though we don't see him. But here, in this version, we're supposed to think Tommy died, and only way later find out he's alive. I really don't know the reason they changed this, since it would have greater dramatic effect when it actually turned out he was alive. Of course, Tommy quote-unquote dying here and magically appearing much later might be a bit of a stakes-lowering cliche. Plot armor and all that. It also would have been less impactful when they eventually meet and Tommy doesn't realize what Ellie means to Joel, since he didn't know about Sarah/Rachel's death. And then again, without Tommy, they wouldn't have any plan to travel across the country to find him, so yeah. Overall, I think this prologue would have been worse than the one we got, and I'm glad Naughty Dog thought so too. Unfortunately though, that's all we have time for today in this first episode. What do you think about the prologue in this alternate, never realized version of The Last of Us? Do you think I did a good job of recreating it? And do you agree or disagree with my points? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. Before I go, I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Traners, sorry if I butchered that, for helping me edit this script and providing some good extra insight for the discussion segment. And until next time, have a great day.